Hello, as we come now to the seventh week of the or what we call regular time, ordinary time. And the readings this week, the gospel is from Luke again, this time chapter 6, verses 27 through 38. The first reading is from the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 26, that is the chapter. And then we get a kind of edited account here. Verses 2, verses 7 through 9, verses 12 through 13, verses 22 through 23. And finally, the second reading, again, a section from 1 Corinthians, still in chapter 15, this time verses 45 through 49. Well, let's begin with the gospel, which picks up exactly where it had left off last time. Now, last time, you remember, was what we would call Jesus' Sermon on the Plain. There had been a number of people, including disciples, others, fellow Hebrew Christians, Gentile Christians, as Jesus, you remember, had given the four blessings and the four woes. And the next verse, which would be in this case verse 37, continues, 27, which continues verse 26. It has to do with Jesus now speaking about the importance of love. Remembering that love can be used as both a noun and a verb, but as it's used in the Gospel of Luke and in some of the other Gospels, it is a verb. In other words, it's not a feeling, like I love you, but it's rather an attitude or a mode of action. And that's the goodwill, the love that the gospel writer Luke pictures Jesus as saying we ought to have to one another. What is found here, of course, is what is sometimes called the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, this saying is found in many other traditions, and in fact was found in the Jewish tradition. A famous thinker contemporary of Jesus' time called Hillel said this: "What is hateful to you, do not do to anyone. That is the whole law. All else is commentary. Go and learn it." This is found in what is known as the Babylonian Talmud, which gives us the sayings and teachings of famous Jewish writers or people we call rabbis. All right. And Jesus is pictured here. When the woes and beatitudes had ended, he had been speaking to the whole crowd. Luke points out that I declare to you who are listening. So interestingly, Luke may have in mind not simply those who are standing around him, but also those who hear the gospel. I pause a moment to say that the material that's found in this section is to a great extent also found in the gospel writer Matthew. And what is an often accepted position today is that both Matthew and Luke had what we would call a common source to get some of the sayings and teachings of Jesus. So although Luke has a few little adaptations of the material that's presented here, it is also true to say that Matthew has much of this. Because of the belief that they had a common source, the scholars call the source the Q source, coming from the German word Quell, Q-U-E-L-L, meaning source. So the contention is that the material that these two gospel writers used came from a common source. The only difficulty in accepting the fact of the common source is that no one has ever seen it. So if there was a common source that they used, we do not have evidence of it, so it would be difficult to trace it back to that. All right, so that's just a little aside. So Jesus here now is really teaching that in some ways when we listen to this little section can be kind of strong and difficult for some to accept, even then and maybe even now. Jesus says, "Bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you." Now, be careful here. We are not saying that people who are abused should do nothing about it. When we say pray for them, because sometimes the text can be used in a way that is not helpful and can in fact be hurtful. What do I mean? Well, if a woman is being abused by a husband or a man, just for her to take it and to pray for him is not really what the teaching of the gospel would be. Yes, she should and could find some way to temper and maybe even to get away from that. It's not saying around, as sometimes in the past this text has been unfortunately interpreted, well, just let him beat you up, because after all, he's the husband, you're the wife, take it and pray for him. That's not what the gospel intention is all about here. So I pause again to say that sometimes it's interesting how we can use certain texts of the gospel to our advantage. So, all right, having said that, still to pray for those who curse you. Now, keep in mind that one of the texts in the scripture was that Jesus was cursed for being crucified, because there is a section in the book of Deuteronomy which says exactly that. Cursed is the one who is crucified. Well, Jesus, by his dying, changes that. So there's a lot of interpretation and things that go on in this little section that we need to look at. If someone strikes you on the cheek, turn your face so that he can strike on the other cheek. If someone takes your coat, which would be, well, like my sweater or your outer garment, give him also your tunic or your inner garment. Well, now, what exactly is Jesus advocating here? Just stand there and take it and get beat up? Well, I think we mentioned this before, and something we have noticed here, that one of the great sins in the ancient world is to be shamed, to be put into a position where something you said or did puts you in a disposition toward others that is not very well or very good. So shame, and in our own time, perhaps there's some discussion about whether or not we really realize what shame is all about and how it affects things. But in the first century world, shame was something very bad. So when Jesus advocates, and this is something maybe to look at here, that Jesus isn't just saying, take it. Hit you on one side, turn the other one, let him hit you again. What he does say, and if you look at the idea of shame here, is that if indeed someone strikes you on the cheek, the usual way, and I'm making an assumption here, that the usual way in which someone strikes another is to use their right hand. I apologize to left-handed people, but this is the way in which it was generally understood. So if I hit you this way, now you turn your cheek to me. What I need to do, if I'm going to strike you, is I'm going to use the back of my hand to strike you on the other cheek. That shames the striker. So Jesus is really here maybe arguing not so much to take it, but he is saying don't hit him back or her, but rather put them in a position where maybe they're going to rethink what they're about to do. See what I mean? And secondly, if I hit you, being right-handed, with the back of my hand, my force or strength is not really as strong either as it would be when I come this way. So if shame is the issue here, Jesus is saying maybe that will stop someone from doing a violent act. See? What about the coat? Well, may have noticed that people generally wore 2 layers of cloak. Even to us, we do this. I suspect that under most of your, whatever you're wearing now, is what we would call underwear. Well, in Jesus' time, they didn't have BVDs and those kind of things. You had a long tunic. So what would happen if someone takes your coat from you, and then you, in turn, take off your undergarment, and hand it to that person? What do you look? You stand there naked or in your birthday suit. But what have you done to the person who's taken your coat? You have shamed them. You have made them think twice about taking that coat from you. So you see, there's interpretation here where Jesus is not simply advising people to just take it, and pray for that person. I mean, that's not what is maybe important here. And Luke, who often interprets the material teaching that Jesus gives in a very practical way, says if we're going to stop violence, maybe we need to do something, not returning violence for violence. See, you take something from me, I'll get you. Because they lived in a world, we have looked at this in another place, where what we call the Talon principle was at work. Talon would be spelled T-A-L-O-N. Namely, the adage that, again, we've heard in other places, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that was common. If you do something to me, I'll do it back to you. Even though that particular law sought to kind of limit the amount of revenge or retaliation that you might give, nevertheless, that's what it did. So in a world where that was the principle, where many, not just Jews but others, also felt was the way that that you did things. You get me, I'll get you. Well, how do you stop that? See, again, if you do it that way, we continue to provoke further violence, and in the end, that does not lead to a helpful circumstance or situation. Now, in verse 35, looking here at Luke, these lines of Luke, well, back it up a minute. In verse 32, 33, Jesus' pictures is saying, if you love those who love you, isn't that pretty normal? Even sinners do that. So if you're going to show this love of God for others, it's got to go beyond just those who do you good. Notice the challenge. This is not an easy teaching that we find in these words and in this section. And 3 times this kind of idea, if you do to somebody who does you good, well, you do good to others. If you get something or give something to someone else, well, don't you expect it to come back? So do unto others as you do unto them. Unto you, of course, makes sense here. But Jesus pushes the button a little bit, and in verse 35, a verse that's found only in Luke's gospel, he says, love your enemies without expecting something in return. So if I say, well, I'll love you, but I hope that in turn you'll love me or be nice to me, that's not the motivation that should lie behind this particular action. Instead, what does Jesus suggest in verse 36? Be compassionate. Do not judge. Do not condemn. Forgive. Now, those are tough things to do, aren't they? Easy to say, do not judge. And the judgment here is usually, you do something bad to me, be careful, I'm going to find a way to get back to you. We all make judgments, that's obvious, but it's the kind of judgment that's condemnatory or retaliatory that is being brought to the fore here. Do not condemn. Well, it's easy to condemn certain circumstances. And you'll say, we should condemn it. It's a wrong, really. Isn't that interesting? Forgive. Easy to say, to forgive. And by the way, connected with forgiving here is its counterpart, forgetting. It's easy for me sometimes to say, oh, I forgive you, but I remember what you have done and don't think I'm ever going to forget. See, so it is among the words remembered by Jesus here, of Jesus rather, remembered by Luke, pretty tough, okay? Well, not tough, but pretty strong and encouraging. And the verse 38 goes on to say, the measure that you measure with will be the measure that will be measured back to you. Now, this has to do with the way in which grain was, measuring grain was done in those days. Now, you could bring a bushel, a basket of some kind. So if you brought a little basket, you'd get just so much grain. If you brought a bigger basket, you obviously got bigger grain. And sometimes the way in which the measurement took place was not with having a basket, but with the outer garment, your clothing kind of formed in front of you like a big basket. And the bigger or wider your kind of forming of your cloak here was, the more grain was poured in. So that also was a common practice that went on in the first century world. And thus the truth of it, the measure that you measure with will be the measure that you get. So Jesus here, as a teacher of morality, teaches a remarkably high standard of relationships that involve loving. Loving means going beyond, doing more. Do not do as you would want it done. Now here's the punchline, I think, of this section. Do not do it as you would want it to be done, but do as God would do it. And there is the challenge of Jesus' words in this whole section. It's not an unreasonable demand with nothing but generosity and the abandonment of all claim to retribution. But understanding here that God does not act adversely against people either. So all of this is really a challenging section, isn't it, of Jesus' teaching as found in these verses. Take the attitude that Jesus teaches, the attitude of God for others, and see where that will lead. It's, however, a fundamental attitude, let's face it, that you must be prepared to be vulnerable to a degree that by worldly standards is considered to be foolish. Only stupid people would do something like that. Well, is that so? And there is, of course, the ongoing challenge of this section of Luke's Gospel, of Jesus' story. Which brings us to maybe a consideration of the first reading, which comes from the first book of Samuel. It goes to chapter 26. Now, in this, a little bit of the background to understand, I think, why this particular story is told, is it speaks of the difficulty that existed between King Saul and David. You'll remember that, of course, David had had been chosen by God as the new king to replace Saul. Whether Saul really knew that, we're not sure. He had come into the entourage of Saul, had gone out to battle. One remembers the famous story against the giant warrior, the Philistines, Goliath, and had triumphed. And as they were coming, he was coming back, the chorus, it sounds a little bit like a Greek play, but the chorus were singing, "Blessed be God for Saul who has killed his thousands, and blessed be David who has killed his 10,000s." Well, Saul is pictured as being jealous of this, and thus is really concerned with eliminating a possible threat to his throne. And that's where the book of Samuel tells these stories, that Saul is after David, and David is pictured as fleeing. Now, he's not fleeing just alone. He flees with his own little entourage of soldiers or men. But Saul goes after David with 3,000 men and tries to hunt him down in the desert of Ziphrah, S-Z-I-P-H, which is just west of the Dead Sea. So if you know a little bit of the geography, this is where this action has taken place. David, on the other hand, has an army of just 600, and his nephew, a man named Abishai, is his one kind of faithful companion. So here's the drama. Saul is after David. David is kind of hiding out, trying to escape Saul's efforts to capture him. Well, as it happened, and this is the story that is told, as actually twice, but this is the one time that we hear it this week, as Saul is sleeping at night in his camp. I pictured it. Here he is, kind of camped out. All these soldiers of his, I don't know how they would be sleeping around or in his presence. David comes upon Saul as he's sleeping. He comes into the camp of Saul. Now that's kind of interesting. Did not one of Saul's soldiers woke up? And there's where the writers suggest that maybe God had kind of, I don't know, like remember sprinkled a little thing over them that they all fell asleep. He comes to where Saul is sleeping. There is his spear in the ground. This, of course, is generally where the spear is the location of where the royal person, in this case, King Saul, is sleeping. And he picks up the spear, and his nephew says to him, "Look, I'll put the spear into David. I don't want you to do it because it wouldn't look good for you to kill the king, but I will do it." And David says, "No, we do not kill one who has been anointed by God." Now, of course, David could be a little self-serving here, because if they remember this story later on when he is king, they might not attempt to do this. Anyway, David leaves with his nephew. They leave the camp, and then when they get far enough away, you can see good stories. You can't just let it go by that he was there and nothing happens. Kind of waves or shouts out to Saul, "Listen, why are you doing this to me?" And holds up his spear and says to him, "Look what could have happened. I did not hurt you. I'm not trying to hurt you." Well, and of course, this brings a bit of shame to Abner, who was the head of the soldiers in Saul's army here, that they were not able to protect him. So, and Saul is saying, "Dave, I never really meant it. I get it, that this is," he didn't say Dave, he said David, but I have learned now, and I've had bad advice. It's interesting. even in this little story, how when we do some things that we shouldn't do, we blame others. Well, I've been bad advice here, but I really thank you for sparing my life, and this conflict is over. If only that were true, there are more stories that continue this. But you can see why this little reading might apply to the gospel today, where Jesus says, don't do violence. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. And so David, in effect, says to Saul, you get it, okay? Finally, a quick word about the continuing words of Paul with regard to the resurrection. Remember, for the last 2 weeks, we have noticed this. Here, Paul answers 2 questions. That is, some of the doubts have been formulated by his opponents who deny the resurrection. And Paul here talks about the fact that the nature of the resurrected body will be what is called, now this is important to understand, that in the resurrection we will receive a spiritual body. Now he wants to distinguish that between what we would call the fleshly body. But a spiritual body still means we have the flesh and blood that we have now, says Paul, but that a dimension will be added to it because of Jesus' resurrection that says we too will live and that we will not die. So when we're thinking of spiritual here, I know that term sometimes, I don't know how you think of it, but spiritual is kind of out there. Paul, when he speaks of a spiritual body, is talking about a bodily resurrection. And this is where much of our teaching with regard to the resurrection that uses Paul as a source comes from. So, and he will also use an analogy with regard to Adam, where he kind of changes things around. It is really a kind of clever little metaphor that Paul uses in this regard. He says that Adam was the first man and that Jesus is the second man. But then he turns it around to say that the spiritual man really will be first. So here's Paul's thinking in the end. Just as we are descendants of the earthly man, we also have the potential to become what the heavenly man is and have the same sort of body. Who is the heavenly man? None other than Jesus. And so in the very beginning, that the body was incorporeal and incorruptible, thus in the resurrected body, that will be true. And that's the body of Jesus in his resurrection, and that's the reality that we will share. So our belief says with regard to the resurrection. So if Adam was in the beginning a righteous man, so the last righteous man now in the new world who becomes the first is none other than Jesus. So if Adam was the recipient of life, Jesus is the life-giving Spirit whom we receive. So all of this, admittedly, is a little bit of, and as I've mentioned a couple of times with regard to Paul, who's a pioneer thinker, a little bit necessary to kind of see that he is operating, sharing, wanting to convince the Corinthians, especially those who seem to not believe this, that the resurrection is truly the case. And so, despite, as we saw last time, some contemporary thinkers like Philo and others who did not believe in a real resurrection of the body, Paul teaches and our tradition holds that this is the reality. Well, as we come to worship this weekend, we are reminded of some beautiful thoughts, the resurrection life that we will share with Jesus, but also some challenging thoughts that we are truly to love others as an active way to remember always, I think, that God's love is the love that we seek to model in our actions and in our way of life. Have a good week. Hope to see you again.